This is A Word, a podcast from Slate. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. The term Project 2025, a conservative think tank's blueprint for a second Trump term, has broken out of Beltway debates and into mainstream discussion. But beyond the TikToks and Twitter jabs, what could Project 2025 mean for Americans? And are Black folks a main target?
Project 2025 calls for shifting the attention of the Department of Justice to really eliminating or quashing supposed anti-white racism. And it looks to do this by abolishing affirmative action policies.
What Project 2025 could mean for you, coming up on A Word with me, Jason Johnson. Stay with us. Welcome to A Word, a podcast about race and politics and everything else. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. Project 2025 is the 900-page policy agenda created by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank with very close ties to Trump world. While it was published more than a year ago, it has become a top issue in the presidential race, with Donald Trump trying to distance himself from it and Democrats pointing to it as a plan to smother democracy one policy at a time. Here's Vice President Kamala Harris talking about Project 2025 at a recent event for the American Federation of Teachers in Houston.
So Project 2025 is a plan to return America to a dark past. Donald Trump and his extreme allies want to take our nation back to failed trickle-down economic policies, back to union busting, back to tax breaks for billionaires. Donald Trump and his allies want to cut Medicare and Social Security, to stop student loan forgiveness for teachers and other public servants. And I say to AFT, they even want to eliminate the Department of Education.
But beyond the headlines, how could Project 2025 impact the Black community if Donald Trump wins the White House again? Joining us to talk about that is Brandon Tensley. He's the national politics reporter for Capital B News, a nonprofit news organization focusing on issues that impact African Americans. Brandon Tensley, welcome back to A Word.
Thank you for having me.
For folks who've been trying to give themselves some peace from politics over the summer by watching the Olympics or something like that, can you give us a brief overview of Project 2025 and sort of what's its mission?
As you mentioned, it's this 900-page conservative right-wing manifesto designed by the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank. And basically what Project 2025 seeks to do is to reimagine or really overhaul the federal government to prepare it for a possible second Trump administration. And it looks at doing this overhaul in a variety of ways, looking at education policy, looking at LGBTQ issues, looking at civil rights and the Department of Justice, looking at healthcare, reproductive rights. But it really breaks down in a very granular way over the course of those 900 pages how the federal government could really sort of direct its attention toward serving a second Trump administration or, just another Republican administration.
Project 2025 targets all sorts of progressive policies and, really just basic functions of American government. Which of its proposals explicitly deal with questions of race or racial justice?
I think one area is really civil rights. Project 2025 calls for shifting the attention of the Department of Justice to really eliminating or quashing supposed anti-white racism. And it looks to do this by abolishing affirmative action policies. And so, there's actually a quote that I want to point to from a conversation that I had recently with Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a pioneering scholar of critical race theory. Because, a lot of times when we talk about Project 2025, we talk about it as something that's going to happen. She makes a really good point that a lot of Project 2025 has already been implemented. And so she said, much of what's in Project 2025 has already been rolled out as an attack on and a justification for undermining social justice and equity-based policies. She says you can start with the executive order that Trump signed around the time that he told the Proud Boys to stand by. And so this executive order that she's talking about lays out some key assumptions of Project 2025 that explicitly deal with Black people. This idea that equity constitutes reverse discrimination, the idea that diversity training and various other tools are quote unquote un-American, the idea that equity is a zero-sum game. And so you see these ideas, these assumptions baked into Project 2025 as well. As I mentioned, the anti-affirmative action policies, which have really gathered momentum in the year since the U.S. Supreme Court gutted affirmative action in higher education, but we've seen it really sort of ripple out and affect other areas as well. Voting rights. We've seen Republican lawmakers try to use the logic of overturning affirmative action to push back against racially equal voting maps. We've seen conservative actors use that ruling to target Black-owned businesses, to target healthcare programs that seek to help address racial inequality in our healthcare system. I think what you see here is this really interconnected way that this functions, right? Where you've had the Supreme Court ruling, you have Project 2025 that sort of picks up the baton and lays out how the federal government could really enshrine these anti-equity sort of policies and political visions.
One of the policy proposals here would transform a lot of federal bureaucratic government jobs into political appointments. How would that specifically affect African Americans in those agencies? And I think of the DC metro area where a large amount of the African American middle class is made of people who are federal employees. How would Project 2025 specifically affect, say, an area like that?
Right. I think, for one, when you think about how this could affect people's employment status, right? Whether there would actually be a job for people in an administration that becomes heavily politicized, that it's about political allegiance and fealty more than actually serving your community. So will it be possible for people to even remain employed in a second Trump administration? But then I think also this is something that played out in the first Trump administration. We think about who is creating policies that actually benefit communities, right? And so if you staff up different federal agencies with people who actually do not care about, a city like Washington, D.C., that is plurality Black, who care about what DC residents say about how they want to tackle issues like crime, or how they want to have better transportation or allocation of resources, then you're really doing a disservice to these communities, because you're not actually taking into consideration what they want for themselves. And so that's, I think, immediately what comes to mind.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more on Project 2025 and the potential effects on the Black community. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned. This is Jason Johnson, host of A Word, Slate's podcast about race and politics and everything else. I want to take a moment to welcome our new listeners. If you've discovered A Word and like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And let us know what you think by writing us at aword@slate.com. Thank you.
Former President Donald Trump has rewritten the rules of how the American justice system treats our nation's most powerful people. But long before this year's historic Supreme Court term, or even his presidency, Trump developed an approach to the law that has shielded him from legal accountability on everything from taxes to fraud to discrimination. I'm Dahlia Lithwick. All through August, Amicus will dive deep into Trump's history of bending the law to his will in a series we're calling The Law According to Trump. Hosted by award-winning journalist Andrea Bernstein, the series will highlight the tactics that led to Trump's recurring legal battles and examine the legal blueprint he used to fight back, to better understand how he'll continue to capitalize on his victories and fight to overturn his defeats, whether he does it from inside or outside the White House. Listen to The Law According to Trump on Amicus from Slate.
You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking about Project 2025 with political reporter Brandon Tensley. Project 2025 aims to dismantle the Department of Education, which is something a lot of Republican candidates have called for years. But what changes does it call for that are aimed at Black folks?
So there, I think you can tie it back to when we think about critical race theory, when we think about classroom instruction, when we think about diversity in higher education. And so really giving the Department of Education this mandate to turn away from those sorts of equity-based initiatives or programs, threatening to sever funding for various programs or institutions that have and or continue to have these sorts of programs and policies and initiatives. And so it's really setting up a system that's hostile to people who want to have equity when it comes to classroom instruction, when it comes to access to higher education, when it comes to employment in the arena of higher education or education more broadly.
How would the teaching of, say, Black history be affected even at, say, university level? We've seen that state legislatures and governors may say, well, you can't teach Black history, or, you had sort of an instance with that in Georgia a couple of weeks ago. But at a federal level, if you have something like the Department of Education disappear and they're offering no grants, could that affect universities?
I mean, I think when you look at the funding, especially for state universities, right? So like big state universities that are dependent on various streams of funding. And we've already seen the effects that having governors sign legislation to say that you can't, teach DEI or you can't have DEI initiatives. We've already seen the effects of this, right? And so like North Carolina, we've seen universities get rid of scholarships designed to help Black students attend college. We've seen the gutting of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. I think this happened recently with the University of Alabama systems. So we've seen how specifically for state universities who are really tied to getting this sort of like funding, how those kinds of directives can affect them. And if the Department of Education is saying that we're going to cut off funding if universities have these kinds of programs, that's going to also directly affect, if you're in a red state in particular, that's going to affect what your governor, for instance, or your state legislator is allowing, is prohibiting. So it sort of gives more ammunition, I would say, for state level actors to really push through policies that will have a direct effect on universities, that will have a direct effect in particular on marginalized communities, on Black communities who would benefit from these kinds of programs.
Does Project 2025 deal specifically with like policing and police brutality? And again, this is important because, again, a lot of policing is a local issue, right? It's a state issue. It's a department issue. It's a county issue. It's a city issue. What, if anything, would Project 2025, which is a federal set of policies, what impact would that have on local policing?
Specifically, when we're thinking about policing, or even more broadly thinking about criminalizing certain things, one of the things that Project 2025 demands is that voter registration fraud and unlawful ballot correction, this is a quote from Project 2025, be investigated by the Department of Justice's criminal division instead of by the Civil Rights Division. So I think even the way that we sort of frame these kinds of issues could have a dramatic impact on how we approach these issues, if that makes sense. If you're thinking about something less as a civil rights issue, access to the ballot box, and you're thinking about it more as a criminal issue, I think that could have the effect of damaging the way that we actually interrogate these sorts of issues, these civil rights protections, the way that we sort of bring the police or bring the law enforcement to bear on these kinds of issues.
And, it's the idea that these things become punitive as opposed to corrective, right? And the Department of Justice is sort of weaponized in that way. Capital B does a lot of reporting on environmental justice issues, and a lot of those overlap with Black people. Majority Black communities, are not protected from flooding. Majority Black communities are denied by their state governments and legislatures ways to improve water facilities and everything else like that. How would Project 2025 change environmental priorities in this country in ways that could specifically affect Black people?
So I think one of the most direct ways is that Project 2025 champions the gutting of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so this is the Biden administration's, it's a very wide-ranging law. It would generate approximately 10 million climate-friendly jobs over the next decade. So the policy agenda Project 2025 advises sort of eviscerating greenhouse gas regulations and clean energy programs as well. And I think because, this is America, the impacts of these moves would not be felt evenly. They would be felt more severely in Black communities. And so, my colleague, Adam Mahoney, has explained before that low-income Black people are exposed to the most pollution from power plants and have the highest risk of death from such pollution. And I think it's about 80% of Black Americans live near a coal-fired power plant, compared with about 56% of white people. And so when you're getting rid of these protections that are meant to stave off the uneven impacts of climate change, of environmental sort of degradation, then those movements that Project 2025 is calling for will have a disproportionate impact on Black Americans.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more about Project 2025 with Brandon Tensley. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned. You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking with Capital E national politics reporter Brandon Tensley about the impact of Project 2025 on the Black community. Former President Trump has denied knowing much about Project 2025. There's two lines of thought about this, right? One is that Trump doesn't know a lot of things, so he could honestly be telling the truth that he doesn't know much about Project 2025. But the other part of it is, you say you don't know anything about it, but everybody who's a part of your campaign and your administration or your potential administration has their fingers on it. So draw some lines between Trump and Project 2025 that we've seen as far as people who've written it, people who've authored parts of it, people who have come up with the policies behind it.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it's hard to say that this has nothing to do with you when so many other people in your immediate orbit have a lot to do with Project 2025, right? And so I think the Heritage Foundation came out, was very supportive of Trump. The first Trump administration, the Heritage Foundation, as we said earlier in this episode, has spearheaded Project 2025. And so that already is a gargantuan connection between the agenda and former President Donald Trump. Recently, Paul Dans stepped down as the director of Project 2025, presumably as a way to put a little bit more distance between the Trump campaign and the project. But, at the same time, attaching too much significance to one staffing change, you're overlooking the elements of the blueprint, one, that have already been implemented, as we talked about earlier, but also the fact that, Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation, has made plain that the project will continue. It will go on. CNN also had a recent report that looked at it was at least 140 of Trump's closest associates developed Project 2025. You also have the fact that Trump's running mate, U.S. Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, has deep ties to Roberts, who, again, is the president of the Heritage Foundation. So, again, it's this very interconnected web where it really doesn't matter what Trump says, or what he says and whether it's true, whether he knows a lot about Project 2025 or not, because a lot of the people who would be informing a second Trump administration, who would be helping to craft and shape policies, they're directly involved. So it's happening whether he knows about it or not, whether he wants it to happen or not.
One thing that I think is important for people to understand is how quick this could happen, right? Like, a lot of new administrations come in and they say, this is what I want to do in the first 100 days. And the things that are called for in Project 2025 are pretty radical, right? Like replacing 50,000 employees. That is a gargantuan task that these folks say they want to try and do in the first 100 days. It makes me think of early flashback scene in Handmaid's Tale, where it's like the day that all the women are like forced to leave their jobs and they can't use banks anymore or anything else like that. Imagine, Brandon, a situation where Trump, if he were to get elected, and then he gets elected, and let's say they keep control of the House, right? We don't know, just one branch of government. How fast could these policies be implemented? How quickly could some of the most radical elements of Project 2025 affect our lives? Because you're right, Heritage and lots of groups, they write policy papers all the time. It's basically political fan fiction, right? But how quick could any of this actually happen if he were to get into the presidency with at least one branch of government, one branch of the legislative government on his side?
Well, I think one thing to consider here is the fact that, to your point, it's not just, the Heritage Foundation think tankers who are proposing this. It's not just the White House, whoever's in the White House. It's not just the U.S. House of Representatives, but it really is this much broader, more complicated conservative movement, right? And so you also have to take into consideration the U.S. Supreme Court. You have to take into consideration federal judges, lower level federal judges. And so when I think about how quickly things can be implemented, I think about the power of executive orders. I mentioned the example earlier with the quote from Kimberly Crenshaw about how when Trump had that executive order several years ago, we've already seen that stuff, some of those ideas, those assumptions baked into not just Project 2025, but with a lot of legislation that we've already seen at the state level across the country. So, I think about executive orders. I think about the power that a federal judge has to say, you can't teach this sort of thing anymore, or, this kind of instruction is illegal. Funding is attached to it that affects X amount of states in a particular jurisdiction. I think about the power of congressional gridlock, right? The power to prevent any sort of measures that would ameliorate these lower level, these state level sort of effects of Project 2025. So I think it could be rapid change that happens in a variety of ways. So, just to recap, it's the executive orders. I think it's the power of federal judges. It's the power to prevent things, prevent protection. It's the power to staff up people, to fire people, right? So I think there are a lot of ways that the effects of Project 2025 could be felt very quickly.
Why do you think Project 2025 has caught so much attention? Because again, there are lots of policies that Republicans and conservatives have floated for years. 10, 12 years ago, Paul Ryan had his new tax plan. People weren't talking about his tax plan on, Facebook, 10 or 12 years. It wasn't a huge thing. Trump had all sorts of crazy plans. Everybody's got plans and schemes. Why do you think Project 2025 has become such a topic on TikTok, on Instagram? Why has it captured the fears and concerns of imaginations the way it has? Because it may be a more radical policy than what we've heard, but it's 900 pages. It's 900-page college manuals that people don't read. Why do you think it's caught on so much?
Part of it, honestly, I think is just how succinct it is in terms of presentation. It's not succinct, obviously, in terms of page count, but it's this neatly packaged set of ideas, right, under a very pithy title. Project 2025. I think also the messaging around it has been very effective, or I should say like the counter messaging around it. I think that is something that catches on very quickly. I think when you use certain terms like it wants to sort of eradicate these departments or eradicate these positions or overhaul this or overhaul that, I think it's these things that really jolt people and make them understand that we're not talking about sort of micro changes here and there, but we're talking about sweeping changes to the federal government and everything that is attached to the federal government. But I also think that it's some of the ideas that are just deeply unpopular in Project 2025 that make it very easy for Democrats in particular to push back against it and get other people to understand what Democrats are saying through their messaging. And so in particular, I'm thinking about what Project 2025 says about abortion. And, I think really when you think about abortion, this is why for Trump, I would imagine this is why he wants to distance himself from Project 2025, why he sees it as a political loser. It's because the agenda includes a whole host of unpopular conservative ideas. It talks about using the archaic Comstock Act, which would limit access to a widely used abortion drug. It talks about preventing Medicaid for being used to cover abortion. It talks about gathering data on women who get abortions. And so when you're able to really pluck out these ideas as sort of representative of what Project 2025 is looking to do in terms of the overhauls that it's looking to impose, I think that can be really effective. And it's something that really, really seizes people and catches their attention.
What is one thing you want Black voters to understand about Project 2025 and what they can do beyond voting, right? We always talk about how voting is sort of your minimum level. If you're hearing this right now and you're a concerned citizen, you've heard this podcast, what do they do now besides just vote?
I think that the power of pressure, these sorts of pressure campaigns, beyond voting, I think about the power of whipping up people in your community to be like, yo, have you heard about this? I mean, we saw people talking about Project 2025 at the BET Awards recently. And so I think when you can sort of take that sort of messaging to a ground level, pressure people in the group chats to take it seriously, people talk all the time about pressuring their local elected leaders. Like, hey, I'm really not okay with this. This is something that would directly affect my ability to access XYZ. I think that's effective. And that's something that you can do before Election Day, right? Like that is something that isn't tied to casting a ballot, but it's a way to have conversations and voice concerns about a potential overhaul of the federal government in the months leading up to Election Day. And I think that can be effective when you see it sort of like seeping into popular discourse, into family discourse, into friend discourse. And, that can be just as effective, I think, as voting when it comes to informing people and trying to get people to move.
Brandon Tensley is a national politics reporter for Capital B News. Thanks so much for joining us today on A Word.
Thank you.
And that's A Word for this week. The show's email is aword@slate.com. This episode was produced by Kristie Taiwo-Makanjuola. Alicia Montgomery is the vice president of audio at Slate. Our theme music was produced by Don Will. I'm Jason Johnson. Tune in next week for A Word.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly.